Hello everybody, so a few quick things. Firstly, this is the first video I'm recording where I am wearing a Christmas jumper. Secondly, I record my videos early and I'd like to try and record them, get them in like over a week before they need to go up, because it used to be I'd just get them up like sometimes even recording them the same day, but then I'd just get stressed out. So I'm like, no, I'm going to have a schedule and get ahead of it. And let me tell you, it's lovely being ahead of schedule. But it means that I'm wearing a Christmas jumper at the end of November, but because I want to get this video up, and this will be the first video of Advent, and I'm big into Christmas jumpers. I hope it didn't escape your notice, that I was wearing like autumnal outfits for the entirety of autumn. And no, I do not consider December to be part of autumn. Don't give me that nonsense. It's obviously winter. Like, look, snowflakes. It's winter, okay? Don't leave me out. Like, leave me out. I don't know what I meant there, but no, okay. Sorry, I do need to get into it. All I wanted to say was that I figured to open up the Christmas time, I would touch on a Christian matter. It's Christmas, Christian. Bet you never noticed that connection before. And no, it's not going to be something I'm doing. It's not as if all Advent. And by the way, while I'm at it, Advent plus the 12 days of Christmas. Yes, I will be wearing until, Christmas jumpers until the 5th of January, because that is the last day of Christmas. Christmas decorations go down the 6th of January. Christmas jumpers come off on the 6th of January. It's not just until Advent. A Christmas jumper isn't just for Christmas. It's for the 12 days of Christmas. And then you put it away. So yeah, sorry. The important thing is that I'm not going to be covering, Christian topics all the time, but I figured, this is something I wanted to talk about. And I figured, why not introduce, and by the way, for actual Christmas, I'm going to touch on another Bible thing, because I think that's fun. And there was a point in time where I actually wanted to have a whole channel for like religious stuff, but I'm like, no, actually now I've got this kind of like general whatever I feel like talking about channel, and there's not like an infinite things I can think of to talk about. Why don't I talk about something which I was heretofore saving for another hypothetical channel, which realistically I'm probably not going to start maybe ever, because why would I? Yeah, there'd be no point creating like another channel when, ultimately there's only one channel that's actually my, and I say this not wanting it to sound like I'm being a grifter. It's just the reality. There's one channel which is a cash cow. It's not as if I'm just in it for the money, but I do live in a society, and money is good when you live in a society. So to create a completely, separate channel which would just not actually achieve anything financially is not the kind of thing I can countenance right now. Anyway, the point I want to make, I'm actually going to get onto the subject of the video now, is that when I'm working out, when I'm doing my exercises, I listen to the Egyptian History podcast. Now, I suppose I'll give it a shout out right now. Dominic Perry is the guy who runs it. If you want something to just really work your way through, if you're, like doing something like working out and you don't really like, you can't really be doing like the music. It's like what you really want is something to listen to. Because like when you're listening to something that's like actually engaging you, I realize you listen to music, but like a thing that's like talking to you, then it's, you don't really feel like you're doing a workout. And I could say, oh, watch my videos. But the thing is, I would like it if you watch my videos. And like, I to be honest, think if you do watch my videos, you should do it while you're doing something else. But to be honest, like with my videos, it's not, I guess there is a backlog. So yeah, you could kind of just queue them up. But personally, yeah, I do really like the idea of listening to a podcast. And I kind of arbitrarily chose the Egyptian History podcast. Just because I was like, well, it'll be an interesting thing. And I tell you what, it has been really interesting. So I am, I guess, recommending it, saying check it out. I was actually, when I was planning on starting this video, I was planning on like going into my workout routine kind of almost as a joke, because it's like such unnecessary tangential information. But at this point, I think that I don't think you'd appreciate the joke. I think you've already had enough completely unnecessary tangential information. So I just want to get into the topic of the video, which is that I find it really fascinating how well Egyptian history lines up with biblical history. Not in like, here's the thing, okay? Not in the sense that like there's huge amounts of information in the Bible about Egyptian history, because there isn't, but in a sense of like it lines up suspiciously well, is what I would say. Like you wouldn't expect it to line up as well as it does. The thing I find interesting about the Bible is that it's not like there are these clear things, and it's annoying because it's about the totality, right? It's not just that you can take one single thing and go, well, this can only be explained by the divine. But it's like, there's lots of little things. And I think that's like an underappreciated aspect of the Bible. And of course, it kind of makes sense it is, because in order to understand it, you'd have to look at the Bible holistically. And of course, for a lot of people, they think about the Bible, they think about Egypt, and they just think the Exodus, which I think is, it makes sense because the Exodus is the big thing that stands out. But when you look at Egyptian history in the Bible more holistically, you recognize there's a lot there. And, I think the Exodus is the most problematic aspect of, and I don't mean problematic in a political sense, aspect of the Bible in relation to actual Egyptian history. So, very, very brief point. One of my kind of stretch goals of life, like if I somehow find myself in a situation where I have like excesses of money and influence, one of my goals would be to make a TV series based on the Bible. But significantly, rather than doing, I think, what I say a lot of, as far as I know, there's actually only one TV series that's based on the Bible, does, which is kind of try to make it into a coherent story by sort of cutting stuff out. My plan would be to go the opposite way. Like, because obviously, the big problem with the Bible from a narrative standpoint, like if you wanted to turn it into a film, or a TV show, is that the Bible has just like very basic explanations of things. It just says, and then this happened. And it's like, well, in a film, you want more to go off than that. You actually have to add information. Of course, if you're adding all of that new stuff, you then need to have like more interesting characters and things like that. Like, for example, if you say, and then the Israelites fought this battle. Well, okay, first of all, you want to show the battle. But then if you're going to have this big battle being shown, you need to have like people there you care about, for example. So maybe you want to add like a soldier who's going to die in the battle. So then you set that up. That's kind of what I mean, like adding stuff to make it a more coherent story. And that's something which I find interesting. Of course, one of the things I therefore think about in the back of my mind a lot is how would you actually tell the story? And of course, one of the things would be to show the interface between, or intersection, I guess, between the Bible and real history. So, for example, like an obvious example would be if you want to do the Book of Acts, you can have the Book of Acts, but you don't just want like a whole season of TV or whatever about a guy writing letters to churches. So what could you do? Well, you could include whatever was going on in Rome. You would have the political maneuverings of ancient Rome happening in the background of the Book of Acts. And that's just one example. And with that said, of course, parts of the Bible relate to Egypt. So what would you want to do? You would want to have the political reality of what was going on in Egypt happening at the same time. Now, of course, the problem is that I think a lot of people might suspect that the Egyptian history in the Bible is sort of just made up and doesn't really intersect with actual Egyptian history at all. And this then creates an issue of like, well, how do you actually, for example, the Book of Acts is not made up. And therefore you can include it, it's generally would be considered just as historical as a lot of what we would claim to know about Rome. So there's not really like a religious history versus kind of secular history thing going on there. It's both just accepted history. Whereas with Egypt, that's not quite the same thing. There's secular history, and then there's kind of biblical history, and lots of people who would affirm, the secular account based on the kind of history that they've encountered, would probably say that they don't think the Bible should be taken as a reliable source at all. So there are 3 times, significant times, where Egypt appears in the Bible, in the biblical narrative. And that is, first of all, when Abraham goes there in Genesis, and then when Joseph goes there in Genesis, and then, of course, when Moses is there in Exodus. So, in the biblical account, here are your stories. First of all, Abraham is the first person to go there. And the main thing we're told, because we're not told very much, and this is the key thing, we're not told very much, but we're told that he gets there and he is terrified, because he says this is a place which is filled with violence, which does not fear God, and he is so scared, he is convinced that he will be immediately murdered by people who want to have their way with his wife. So he decides, as an act of self-preservation, to say that his wife is in fact his sister, rather than his wife. And that way he's like, well, that means nobody will have a cause to murder me, because, obviously if you want a guy's wife, you got to murder the guy first. But if it's just her brother, it's no issue. So he's like, yeah, I'll just say I'm her brother. And then he ends up meeting Pharaoh. And Pharaoh is like, oh boy, Abraham's wife is called Sarah. I believe at this point she was called Sarai, but I'm going to call her Sarah because, it's the whole name thing. I don't think Abraham was called Abraham at this point either. I think he might have still been called Abram. So Abraham and Sarah, I will say. Pharaoh says, oh, she looks like a bit of all right. And he basically, Pharaoh, essentially takes Abraham's wife as his wife. And then it causes a situation where Egypt faces some plagues, some divine punishment. I think there's a drought. And I also think I'm right in saying that the women stop getting pregnant. And obviously, back in the day, being able to have kids was quite an important thing. It's kind of like, it has to be said, it was one of the main things women were doing back in ancient societies, because infant mortality was pretty high. Last thing you want is a dry spell of no fertility. So what's going on here? Okay, I'll say right now, this is something which then happens later. There's a similar scenario with a guy called Abimelech, and this is also why I should bring up the fact that I don't think Abraham is supposed to be portrayed sympathetically here. And I say this because Abimelech is portrayed very sympathetically, and he basically says to Abraham when this happens, he says, what were you doing? That's really, you're a real annoying person. And of course, Abraham does at several other points disobey God. And interestingly, a lot of the time he disobeys God in a way that ends up kind of rejecting his wife. So the other famous example, of course, is that he sleeps with Hagar, his wife's slave, let's be real here. And that is a bad thing. He shouldn't have done that because, apart from anything else within the biblical narrative, this is after God has already promised him that he will have a child by Sarah. So his decision to sleep with Hagar indicates a lack of faith in God. And I think that's a recurring thing. And basically, the point is that I think that Abraham lying about his wife's identity is not supposed to be seen as a good thing. It's supposed to be seen as a bad thing. And basically, long story short, one way or another, it might be by an angel, but I forget, because it's an angel in the case of Abimelech, which is, I think, another reason why we can infer that Abimelech's kind of portrayed sympathetically, because it's an angel comes to him. But Pharaoh finds out and he says, what are you doing? Stop that. And then he kicks Abraham out. That's the story. not, you might think, okay, that's an interesting story. Now, the next story, of course, is the Joseph story. Now, this one's obviously a bit more involved. Joseph, sent to Egypt, the main thing that matters, like the main thing that I guess you could say is big. Obviously, you have the whole story. He gets sent to prison, and then he uses his magical dream prophesying ability, dream interpreting ability, to basically function as a prophet. And he ends up getting chummy with Pharaoh, and he essentially seems to really help Egypt out. He basically, with his divine prophesying ability, is able to make it so Egypt is flourishing even while there is a famine going on. And of course that then leads to the situation where his brothers then come to him seeking food, and Joseph's like, I'll show them. I'm Joseph and you tried to kill me. I hope people know like the basics of the Joseph story, because it's a good musical, or I think it is, and that's an endorsement. Anyway, the point is, so Joseph says, I'm Joseph, I'm awesome, I'm great, and look what I did. Look at how great Egypt's doing. Third thing, Exodus. Egyptians enslaved. Moses says, let them go. Pharaoh says no. Big Red Sea separates. Well, the plagues, then the Red Sea separates. Then Pharaoh's army gets destroyed in the Red Sea. Moses goes and wanders in the desert. He's now left Egypt. Here's the thing. You kind of have free reign with exactly where you want to place the date. But obviously, once you place a date, everything else falls into place relatively. And if you place the Exodus in the 15th century BC, then something interesting happens. You end up with Abraham arriving in Egypt in the, I think, 20th century BC. Now, the thing about the 20th century BC is that it was after the first intermediate period. And the first intermediate period was basically a period where Egypt went through civil war. So if you know anything about like Egyptian chronology, then it's essentially, you count the dynasties, and generally speaking, when you have one united dynasty ruling Egypt, that's considered like the standard. And then, if you ever find yourself in a situation where there's more than one dynasty ruling Egypt, that is considered an intermediate period. So, obviously you have early Egypt. I think that's like a better term for it, but the early kingdom, I think it's called. So the early kingdom is, pyramids built, all that. And then, eventually, you end up with a civil war situation where two different sides are ruling Egypt for, several generations. And one side, I believe the side located in Upper Egypt, and the interesting thing about Upper Egypt is that, and I find this very confusing, even though it makes complete sense, it's not north-south, it's relative to the Nile. So if you think Upper Egypt, you'd probably think to yourself, oh, like northern Egypt. But no, actually, the Nile, of course, flows from south to north. So if you went up the Nile, you'd be going south. So Upper Egypt is southern Egypt, Lower Egypt is northern Egypt. Another interesting fact actually about the Nile, which I found out from the Egyptian History podcast, when not even gonna, it might have been Thutmose the first, but don't hold me to that. He was really getting a proper big empire together, and he got all the way to the Euphrates. But when he got there, he was so freaked out because the Euphrates was like the other major river. Like there was the Nile, and I don't know if they even I don't think there are a huge number of rivers in the Middle East, to be honest. It's not like England where there's rivers everywhere. So there was the Nile, but I guess he would have encountered the River Jordan. But the point is, the Euphrates was a big river. It matched the Nile in terms of significance. And the Euphrates flowed from north to south. And essentially, this meant that from the Egyptian perspective, they were like, oh, this river's going the wrong way. It could actually just be that the Jordan flows, south to north, like the Nile does. That might make sense. Anyway, point is, they looked and they're like, this river's going the wrong way. And apparently, this freaked them out so much that it's one of the reasons why they decided to stop their conquests. They were like, I don't know if we should be crossing this river. It's going the wrong way. So I think that's an interesting fact. And, I guess shock horror. Yeah, the Nile was important to the Egyptians. So the idea of a different river going the opposite way, they were like, okay, no, that's not how it's supposed to go. Anyway, so where was I? Oh yeah, okay, so there were, I think they were the Thebans in Upper Egypt. And they took over the rest of Egypt, or rather, Lower Egypt, and reunited the kingdoms. But what's interesting is that I think the first guy might have been called Amenhotep.
Montuhotep II, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, had reunified his kingdom, but it was time to reassert Egyptian martial glory and supremacy abroad. But to successfully defeat these people, Montuhotep needed the blessing of his namesake deity, Montu, the war god.
I'm just going to refer to him, I think it's a him, as the god of war from now on, in case I've got the name wrong. Now, they're basically, so the Thebans, they started really worshipping this god of war. And that was kind of the context in which they ended up taking over the rest of Egypt. So they got to a point where by the time they'd taken over Egypt, they were glorifying, I think this might have been the 17th dynasty, it could have been the 16th. I think it was 17th though. No, 11th. I don't know why I was completely off with 17th, no, ignore me. I think it was the 11th dynasty, could have been the 10th. There we go. Phew. So yeah, I think this was the 11th or 10th dynasty. And they basically got to a point where they were obsessed with the god of war. Because they decided, we're going to reunite the country, we're going to, do all of this, worshipping, honoring of the god of war, and then, through war, we're going to reunite Egypt. And essentially, you did end up, with this society that worshipped the god of war. And, like I say, this is also exactly where you can place Abraham showing up, if you assume 15th century for Exodus. So, Abraham, and then you kind of work backwards from the chronology. Abraham shows up here. And this is interesting, isn't it? Because the one thing, and literally the one thing, the story of Abraham in Egypt, it doesn't even take up a whole chapter, I don't think. The one real piece of information we're given is that this is a society which Abraham immediately looks at and thinks, oh, this is a hyper-violent society where I could be killed, so I need to do this thing to avoid being killed. That's the one thing we're really told about Abraham's impression of Egypt, and it's essentially the entire premise for the story. This isn't some irrelevant detail that's being, slapped in there. This is the entire premise of the story. He says, wow, this is a society which seems violent, and not okay. And it just so happens that it's at this exact point in Egyptian history when you have this society which completely is obsessed with this god of war. And they're really into this god of war. And it's I think most of the time, you would maybe know, Egypt was kind of all about worshipping the sun. I think the sun god was called Re, which is funny because rays of sun. Anyway, usually they're about worshipping the sun, but this one period of time, they're worshipping the god of war. And that's kind of the key thing. If this was 100 years earlier, it would have been a different, maybe you could say, okay, it would have also been a bad situation because it's the intermediate period. But if it had been 100 years later, no, this is Egypt as we know and love it, peaceful, kind of, not really any reason to be particularly terrified of it. And again, generally speaking, Egypt is not the kind of place that you think about and you think, oh, a horrendously like violent, bloody place where you'd be terrified if you just showed up there. And yet for Abraham, that's the impression he got. And it just so happens that it works out timing-wise that it's exactly at this point where you do have Egypt coming out of this civil war and completely glorifying and honoring this warrior god. Interesting, I think. Also, there is actually a story of one of the kings at this time, who there's like the story where they like pray for rain and then they get rain, and he like goes out into the rain and he's like really into it. I remember that from the history podcast, and that's kind of interesting. You know, it would maybe work with the whole like the drought caused by taking Abraham's wife, but you know, that's not, you know, like I'm not saying definitely, I'm just saying that's an interesting thing. It's not like a huge thing. The interesting thing though is that this dynasty, it didn't last very long, because there was a guy called Amenemhat, and he was like, I think a scribe, some kind of like servant of the king who was at the king's court, and he wanted Egypt, I guess you could say, to be better. You know, he wasn't really into this whole, you get the impression this was not a great time for Egypt. You know, they were ruled by these people who were like worshipping this god of war. And I think, to be honest, you know, thinking back over the podcast, I think this might be the only moment where this happens, which is somebody decides to start a new dynasty simply based on the fact that they don't like the way things are happening currently. So usually like a new dynasty happens because the male lineage runs dry, or sometimes there's like two competing, you know, people for the throne, and it ends up that, you know, one of them. But the thing is, this is the really only example I can think of where essentially you just have this guy who's like, no, I want things to be different. So that just kind of tells you how like this was not a great time for Egypt, that this guy's just like, no, we've got to overthrow the king, which is something which you wouldn't, you know, Egypt, they believe their kings were literally gods, but they're like, no, you know, we want to have this Amenemhat guy instead. Now, Amenemhat started a new dynasty, and it led to this guy called Senuseret III. And it just so happens that if you follow the timeline, or the chronology as it would make sense to reconstruct it, this is exactly when Joseph shows up. It's also a golden age for Egypt. Like, this was, I think if Egypt had a golden age, it was this period of time. It was like the best. Senuseret, he's really considered just awesome. You know, maybe you could say, oh, when they were building the pyramids and stuff, but to be honest, like, I think with the pyramids, it's just that they, you know, had a lot of free time. But this was like a period where everything was like great. And it's kind of, I almost can't even be bothered to substantiate exactly how it was great. It just was. Like, this was the 12th dynasty. And it was great. It was the best dynasty. I don't think it gets better after this. I don't think it was better any time before this. And that's interesting, because you think, well, maybe this would make sense if they had a guy running things who also had maybe somebody working for him who had like magical prophetic powers. You know, maybe that would be the kind of thing that would improve your kingdom. So it's like, again, it just so happens that it works out that, oh, this time when Egypt was doing like really well also happens to line up with the time where, if you look at the biblical chronology, somebody with magical prophesying abilities would have been there. It's just a really, you know, just really convenient. It works out that way. But what's even more crazy is that the story of Joseph actually ends with Joseph inviting his family to come live with him. And the 12th and 13th dynasties are significant in that a large number of people from Canaan, which at the time was what, you know, modern day kind of, well, Israel-Palestine is called, Canaan. So lots of people are now coming from Canaan at this exact time.
Foreigners had been settling in increasing numbers. Over the next few decades, these would become so influential that they actually disrupted the political structure of the kingdom itself. So what better time to take a break and chat about these foreigners, and the culture from which they emerged? The foreigners in question were a group commonly known as Canaanites. Canaan is an old term, encompassing the areas of Israel, Palestine, Gaza, West Jordan, Lebanon, and South Syria.
Which is exactly what Joseph made happen. Joseph said, okay, everyone, like my family and all the gang, can come down here. And that's exactly what happens at this point. Which is, again, interesting. And it's important. Like, this isn't like, it's not as if everywhere you look, it's just people are constantly coming from Canaan. It's not as if everywhere you look, there are these big golden ages happening. No, this was a very specific thing that happened at this very specific point in time, and it happens to line up with exactly, the biblical narrative. Now, after this, you get a group of possibly Arabian, some kind of Asiatic nomads showing up, called the Hyksos.
Well, the Hyksos came from Arabia or the Levant. No one is exactly sure where. What we do know is that their language seems to have been a common ancestor to modern Arabic and Hebrew, an ancient language that we call West Semitic.
And the Hyksos conquer Egypt, and they put Egypt through the Second Intermediate Period. So basically the Middle Kingdom, which was basically the time just mentioned all then, ends, and eventually, through a series of kind of bloody conflicts, it's actually a really interesting story, and it's kind of like a proper kind of matriarch story where there's this woman who, her husband dies in war, he's like really brutally murdered, and then she kind of trains, she trains her first son to like fight, and then he gets murdered too, or, killed in war. I don't know if you can really call that murder. And then she eventually trains her next son, and he goes on and actually does win. And then I think she's also like, then there's kind of a succession crisis that happens quite soon after that, and she's in charge of that as well. She kind of works it all out, and she basically becomes, like a really powerful woman, which is, just, girl power. But the interesting thing is that this would have been a time where you could maybe understand that the Egyptians were hating the non-Egyptians, that their country had just been invaded by the Hyksos. And there is an interesting thing where the Nubians allied with the Hyksos, and shortly after and now I think we are on the 18th dynasty, finally, the 18th dynasty was established. One of the kings, probably a Thutmose, possibly even the same Thutmose who went to the Euphrates, attacks the Nubians and basically commits something like a genocide, like basically again, I should clarify, my only source is the Egyptian History podcast, which, just in case this isn't clear, it's not like a Christian podcast or anything like that. It's just a pure historical thing. And it's, really the go-to podcast on Egyptian history. So it's not as if I'm like randomly picking this one particular source. No, it's a source that just happens to be on Egyptian history. Anyway, but according to that, this campaign in Nubia is literally just a campaign of pure revenge. Like, it doesn't really have much strategic value. It's just the Nubians, when Egypt was weak, because they'd been invaded by the Hyksos, the Nubians basically attacked the Egyptians, and now the Egyptians are like, hey, now we're powerful, we're gonna take revenge on you by just destroying everything, killing loads of you, all that kind of stuff. And Dominic Perry of the Egyptian History podcast describes it as war crimes.
The king of Kush had allied with the hated Hyksos rulers and even tried to invade Egypt. The Thebans did not forget or forgive this, so when Thutmose came south into deep Nubia, he took vengeance to the very limit of his ability. You might call it an attempted genocide, and I don't think you'd be too far off the mark. Imagining the horror of this campaign is quite difficult today.
Now, that group of Canaanites, or people from Canaan, more accurately, because there's different kinds of people who live in Canaan. That group that showed up in the 13th dynasty, they really, there's no indication that they left, that they disappeared. So is it possible that in this genocidal fervor of hatred of foreigners, there was a plan to commit a genocide against the Jews living in Egypt? That would make sense, right? Like, this is Egypt. They've already shown that based on the trauma of having just been invaded, they are willing to commit war crimes in Nubia. Why wouldn't they be willing to commit war crimes or crimes against humanity in their own country against this population, which we already know lives there? So then you have the murder of the young Jewish children, young Hebrew children, which of course is in Exodus. Now, obviously, there's nowhere in the Bible, nowhere in the secular Egyptian history does it say that this event happened, but it would make sense that it did based on other things. Based on or it makes sense that it could have happened quite easily. Now, interestingly, Hatshepsut, she's a future pharaoh, but at this point, she is actually taking over from, the woman I mentioned, who was the kind of OG matriarch, in some sense. She also was a priestess, and that was one of the ways she kind of held power, by being a priestess. And Hatshepsut has also been made a priestess too. But she doesn't have any children. She can't, so she's married to, I think, her brother. I think that's just a thing that happened, in these royal families and stuff, and probably maybe explains why she couldn't have any children. But yeah, she doesn't have any children, and okay, I'll go through the actual events that happened before including any speculation. So she doesn't have any children. Her husband has children by a concubine, and essentially her husband then dies, and Hatshepsut somehow pushes out the concubine, and ends up acting as regent for the concubine's child. And then Hatshepsut begins establishing herself as the pharaoh. While she's technically acting as regent, she basically, becomes as though she is the pharaoh. And then she dies, and here's the interesting thing. Several years later, a decade or two later, suddenly there is an attempt to completely erase her from history. Thutmose III, who is Hatshepsut's, I can't think of what, well, I guess technically his nephew, if I'm right in saying that Thutmose II was Hatshepsut's brother as well as husband. But yeah, Thutmose III decides that he really suddenly, a decent while after she has died, decides that he wants to absolutely remove any evidence of Hatshepsut's reign.
In regnal year 42 or so, the king made a decision that would have an immense ripple effect through history. No longer willing to accept Hatshepsut's visibility in monuments, Thutmose decided to remove the queen-king from the public record. The word went out. Thutmose's artisans, his stonemasons, scribes and sculptors, now went into the temples and shrines of Thebes. They took chisels and hammers and set to work. Wherever they found the name of Hatshepsut, they chiseled it out, replacing it with the name of other royal women from the family.
And this is something which confuses Egyptologists to this day, because it's not clear why he would have done this like so much longer after she'd already gone. Like, what was the reason for suddenly wanting to erase her from history?
Many scholars have puzzled over Thutmose's execration of his aunt. It's a puzzling question, because out of a reign of some 54 years, the king only became concerned with Hatshepsut's lineage in about year 42. So for 20 years after her actual death, Thutmose didn't seem to care about her that much.
And that's basically... Okay, so now I'm going to insert Exodus into this, and then I'm going to cover some of the issues. So if you insert Exodus into this, you say, okay, so Hatshepsut, she doesn't have any kids. What if she finds Moses and takes him out? And Moses is, as we all know from the film, the Prince of Egypt. He has a brother, and the brother becomes king. Moses does the whole, has a fight with somebody, kills the slave driver, and then ends up fleeing. Comes back during... Hatshepsut's now at this point dead. He comes back during the reign of Thutmose III. The whole thing happens, 10 plagues, blah, blah, blah. Thutmose III gets a real spanking in many ways. And then he gets back and he says, oh boy, I am angry. And what does he decide to do? He decides to blame the person who it makes sense for him to blame, well, in his view makes sense for him to blame, Hatshepsut, the person who effectively adopted Moses. And to punish Moses, if you like, or even just to express his anger at what has just happened in the Exodus, this incredibly negative experience for his kingdom, he decides to destroy all of the records and monuments and all that kind of stuff of Hatshepsut. And this would make sense. It would explain why it is that suddenly, significantly into his reign, he decides to completely try to erase Hatshepsut, because he's so angry because of what just happened with Moses. Now, there are 3 issues. This is the first point where you run into like some historical issues, because so far everything has worked out really well from these 3 events. Like, the way they map onto Egyptian history works really well. At this point you run into some issues, of which there are 3, and hopefully I knew there were 3, and I'm just trying to think if I'll be able to remember what the 3 are. So the first issue is that you could say, well, why isn't there any mention of Moses? And now, to that I would say that, of course, you would say, well, he tried to erase Hatshepsut, so you could say, well, he tried to erase Moses too, but he failed to erase Hatshepsut. We know who Hatshepsut is. We know quite a bit about her, but here's the thing. Moses was not Hatshepsut. Even in this scenario, there's no reason to think that there would be like huge amounts about Moses, and it's, bear in mind, he disappeared for a pretty substantial period of time. So with that said, it would make sense to imagine that there was less information there. And also, of course, Thutmose III would have been way more angry at Moses. Like, his anger spilled over to Hatshepsut, but he would have been principally like really angry at Moses. So it makes sense that there would be less stuff there to be destroyed, and it makes sense he'd be more thorough in destroying it. And it does certainly work that we have the Exodus placed now at a point where we literally have a king who tried to erase somebody from history. So it could make sense if he tried to erase one person, maybe he succeeded at erasing another person. Now, the other issue is why is it that Hatshepsut didn't elevate Moses to power? Because that's kind of the issue. In the story as we know it, I just remember what the third issue is, so good. I'll say it now. The third issue is exactly like how much of an impact does this actually have on Egypt. So yeah, I'll just say, so the second issue, yeah. the story as it seems to be in, secular Egyptian history as like somebody who wasn't using the Bible as the source would understand it, is that Hatshepsut has no children, and that's why she pushes out this concubine in order to act as regent for Thutmose III. And the question becomes, surely, if she was interested in this whole like dynastic politics and gaming the system and all that kind of stuff, she would try to supplant Thutmose III with Moses. Like, wouldn't that make more sense that she, because that's something which certainly when you look at women who have, had children, especially in like situations where men have several legitimate heirs by different wives, because it's a more kind of polygamous society, you'll often get the women fighting with each other to put their children on the throne, often with some pretty brutal and horrendous murders happening along the way. So, and by the way, like, yeah, I have no idea whether or not this concubine woman was killed or something. Who knows? It will be there's definitely, like, I was talking about the whole like kind of Game of Thrones thing. I feel like there's definitely a Game of Thrones thing going on there of like what happened to this concubine. But yeah, basically, why would she have become regent to Thutmose III, who is not her child, when she would presumably be, like, Moses is her adopted child. Like, you would think that she would have more of a relationship with Moses than she would with Thutmose III. Like, you got Thutmose III, who is just her husband's, child with another woman. And then you have Moses, who she literally adopted in this scenario. Why doesn't she try to elevate him to the position of Pharaoh? And I don't think there's like a satisfying, I don't think there's like an obvious solution. Like, well, clearly it was because of this. But I think there are solutions, and that's kind of just the point. I guess that's like the main, like, spoiler alert. I just think really for a lot of these issues, the conclusion is just, well, there are solutions. And in this case, maybe it was that, like, Moses was not viewed favorably just because, like, he wasn't actually born naturally. Maybe there was this idea, or it could of course be that Moses was going to be elevated to something else. For example, maybe Moses was going to be put into a different position, like in the priesthood or something like that, considering you could imagine that maybe Hatshepsut would have argued that Moses was some kind of miraculous birth or something like that. You could easily imagine a situation where the argument was, Moses doesn't need to be, Moses isn't going to be the pharaoh because he's not directly from the lineage of the king, but he might be heavily involved in the priesthood because he was a miraculous birth to Hatshepsut. And of course, Hatshepsut, by the way, really made an active effort to deify herself as part of her like claim to essentially ascend to the role of pharaoh. She basically argued that she had been commissioned by the gods themselves to become the pharaoh. And, who's going to argue with her? So Hatshepsut was very much into deifying herself. So it would make sense if she had this Moses, she would say, yeah, Moses was given to me by the gods. Now, within that context, it would make sense maybe that there was just this established idea that Moses would become, like I say, involved in the priesthood and be much more on kind of the religious end of things rather than the ruling end of things. And obviously, we just need to get him up to the age of when he has that altercation with a slave driver and ends up having to flee Egypt. And at that point, obviously, he's out of the picture. The question, so really the only question is, why didn't Hatshepsut make any move to put Moses in charge before then? And it would seem like, it's worth noting, you could almost say based on like erasing, Thutmose III having erased people, that maybe there was an attempt to put Moses in charge and Thutmose III erased it. That's possible. But I do think the reason why that's not quite as satisfying is because I think that in order for the theory that Moses, anything pertaining to Moses was erased, you have to argue that there wasn't that much stuff there. And I think it would be harder for Thutmose III to have erased the existence of Moses if he was literally the heir apparent at one point. So yeah, I mean, it could work. Again, like, there's no reason why it couldn't work, that maybe actually, yeah, Moses, like, Hatshepsut did have Moses as the heir apparent, and then Moses, went AWOL, and then that's when everything kind of changed. But, you don't need it. Of course, the third issue, like I say, is, well, how does this fit in with, like, Egypt? Like, according to this story, Egypt had these really big, serious plagues. The army was destroyed in the Red Sea. Did this have a massive effect on Egypt? And the answer is no, which is not particularly, it's not, like it would be if somebody could say, oh, and then at this point it was a massive, like, to be honest, if I could say, like, oh, and then also there was this massive unexplained, like, period where Egypt just lost a huge load of population and a huge army, then as far as I'm concerned, that would be sort of almost like slam dunk. Like, I don't think you could realistically argue that, like, at that point it would be too perfect. At this point, no, there is this issue of, like, it doesn't seem like there was anything wrong with Egypt at this point. It doesn't seem like Egypt faced a massive, disastrous situation that you might expect if they faced 10 divine plagues and this pretty substantial destruction of their army. Now, there is the possibility that, of course, Egypt was just resilient. Countries can be resilient. I will say the Exodus can also be dated to a different date, because there is a king who did have, like, a massive series of almost comical disasters, and this was, like, later on, so this is kind of a later dating. Interestingly, like, in a lot of standard media, the Exodus is shown to happen during the reign of Ramesses. The thing about that is there's no benefit to that at all. Like, it literally, there's no reason why that lines up historically. So, it's literally, it almost seems kind of random. It's a bit like how in a lot of Exodus media, you see them building pyramids, even though they weren't building pyramids. The pyramids were built much earlier than that. But yeah, basically, I'll just say that Ramesses, no, there's this other guy, and I don't think anything else works. Like, I think, to be honest, there's too much else that works about the Tutmosis III Hatshepsut theory, and therefore I think it's easier to just say, well, maybe, yeah, Egypt maybe was just resilient. Maybe also it's true that kind of propagandistic elements meant that the losses were understated. I mean, that's the thing that happens. People will understate their losses, and of course people will overstate their victories. So it's hard to say. It's also, of course, possible that Exodus, I say people exaggerate their victories. Well, maybe the entire book of Exodus is an exaggerated victory. That ultimately, for example, something you see in the Bible is, and this is also relevant regarding the morality of the Bible, is you'll see things like, and the Israelites fell upon this nation and they totally destroyed them. Man, woman, child, they left nobody alive. The entire city was reduced to ashes. And it was every single person who breathed in it was killed. They were slaughtered by the sword. It was a total annihilation, a veritable genocide. And then you get to 2 chapters later, and that city reappears, and it's just completely fine. And what's the conclusion there? I suspect the conclusion is, and literally it's inhabited by the same people. It'll be the Amalekites of, I don't know, Bethel. I'm going to say Bethel. Which, by the way, I don't think the Amalekites inhabited Bethel. Biblical geography, I wouldn't even want to pretend that I can do it well. But I think maybe the Amalekites were in Shechem, so let's go for that. Okay, the Amalekites of Shechem. There'll be a story the Amalekites of Shechem were totally destroyed. And then later on, and it will really stress, let me be clear, these people were so destroyed, they could not have been more destroyed. And then 2 chapters later, oh, it's the Amalekites of Shechem. Now, I guess this is when I'll drop a key point, which you always need to know if you're ever going to do any kind of look into the Bible. There is a difference between inerrancy and literalism. You can believe the Bible is inerrant without believing the Bible is literal. Because, and a good analogy here would be, if I wrote a book on, Germany in World War II, I write it, and at one point I say, and then they went through the looking glass. The looking glass. They went through the looking glass. I don't know why. That's the particular thing. And then you read it and you go, oh yeah, it was a good book. Of course, it wasn't inerrant. It did have an error. And so I said, what was the error? And you say, well, it said they went through the looking glass, but actually at no point did any of the Nazis walk through a mirror. I think that's what a looking glass is, a mirror. If I said let me tell you, it was raining cats and dogs. That seems like a weird thing to write, but it's an expression, raining cats and dogs. And it's like, yeah, it was a good book, but it wasn't inerrant because there was that thing about it raining cats and dogs, but it's never rained cats and dogs. Again, the point is, yeah, if you're taking it literally, then you would have to say it's raining cats and dogs, literally. But the point is, seeing as I obviously didn't mean it literally, it's not an error. That's basically the obvious point. The Bible can literally have, in some sense, false information in it, but if there is a credible case that it was not intended to be literal information, then it's still inerrant. Now, biblical inerrancy is something I'm going to get into in just a second, but I just want to stress that, of course, I don't think that this is a massive goof. I don't think it's a mistake that you have in one instance the Amalekites in Shechem being totally destroyed, and then 2 chapters later they show up and they're fine. What I suspect is that it is a literary device, a very clever one, called exaggeration. That's what it is. It's essentially they defeated the Amalekites in battle, but that's not very interesting. So it's a total destruction. Which, yeah, like I said, this has big implications when you want to talk about the morality of the Bible, because a lot of it relies on they killed the children and all that. And it's yeah, if this, depending on how far this exaggeration thing can be taken as going, and I think it can be taken as going quite far, the point is that you can't say it's not a mistake or an error if the Bible exaggerates. And then when you look at that in the context of Exodus, you could allow for Egypt to have not been necessarily anything as severely affected as you would necessarily, if you read the Bible just plainly and literally, you might assume, oh, this would really affect them. This would totally destroy them. But, by the Bible standards, you could literally have a thing about how every single person in Egypt was totally killed and there was none that breathed and every house was reduced down to rubble. And then 2 chapters later, Egypt could show up completely fine. So, in that context, maybe some of the plagues are exaggerations. It could actually be, and again, this isn't saying the Bible is not inerrant. The Bible could still be inerrant, and exaggerating, because people who exaggerate aren't making an error. They're intentionally doing it as, a means of expression. So there we go. I just, really wanted to, stress that. Now again, it's not perfect. And on the subject of not perfect, this leads us to, I think, the biggest issue with the Exodus story, which is, because I want to, here's the thing, okay. One of the reasons I'm making this is because I think there's some people who literally think that biblical history in some cases is such nonsense that you literally should not believe in the Bible based on biblical history. And I don't think that's true. I think biblical history is actually pretty solid. Okay, actually, one other thing, before I get into the other thing. Some people say, why did the Israelites flee to Canaan when at this point Canaan was controlled by the Egyptians? This is just, actually, it's quite a simple point. The Egyptians, they were very centered around the Nile, and ultimately when you talk about controlling a piece of land, it means that they, presumably compelled tribute from that land. They had an official acknowledgement from that land that they were ruling it, but it's not as if they had a, continued military presence. It wasn't like an occupation in the sense we might think of it today. And the reality is that the Israelites, for a decent while, were maybe, they didn't completely conquer. The Israelites don't unite Israel behind a common king until the start of the kingdom, which is in the 11th century BC. So, like I say, the Exodus happened, I think, in the 15th century BC. It's not until the 11th century BC that we get a kingdom of Israel forming. And, yes, sorry, I mean, there's no ambiguity there. The Kingdom of Israel is acknowledged as a historical reality. So the formation of the Kingdom of Israel isn't even something where there's like a dispute between secular history and biblical history. If you go on Wikipedia and look up the Kingdom of Israel, it will just show you the Kingdom of Israel, and yeah. So in that context, we all agree on that. Now, the interesting thing is that between the Exodus and the establishment of the Kingdom of Israel, there is a period which is where the judges ruled. Now, the judges were basically like small tribal chieftains, and the essential structure of the Book of Judges is that Israel goes through periods of being dominated by other powers and then throwing those powers off. And it happens like, I think like 5 times or something like that, which, within the space of 400-ish years, I think, over 400 years, that could make sense. And basically, when you consider that, it's like, well, if the Israelites are constantly they get subjugated by a foreign power, and then they have a rebellion, and then they reestablish themselves, and then they get subjugated again, that's like, it's basically a cyclical thing. That's what happens during the Book of Judges. There's lots else going on there, like kind of thematically, which is very interesting, but that's basically the structure of the narrative. And within that context, for example, you could look at the fact that the Egyptians fought the Battle of Kadesh, which was a major military engagement that happened in Canaan. And you might say, well, hold on a minute. If the Egyptians were in Canaan, why didn't they just, how does that interface with the biblical narrative? But the reality is, if this was at a point where the Israelites were in subjection to a foreign power, then it wouldn't interface with the Israelite narrative, because the Israelites weren't ruling Canaan during that time. So the point is, basically, for 400 years after Exodus, the Israelites were on and off, going through a cycle of establishing themselves and then being subjected, and then establishing themselves and being subjected. So that pretty much, like, there's no reason to think that the Egyptians would have been like, and I mean, ignoring the fact that after like a couple of decades, it's not as if they'd be like, oh, let's go get them because of this grudge, especially considering the fact that Tutmosis III, I think, actually tried to completely conceal this information. So I think it would have been public memory, but I think it's quite realistic that maybe, people just didn't, he wanted to make people not really remember it. So that's like another reason to not really want to pursue it too much. So yeah, overall, point is that I think that makes sense. Now, okay, here's the big issue. I'm finally at it. Numbers. This is the huge issue, especially if you want to argue for inerrancy, which, inerrancy, I think inerrancy is nice. Biblical inerrancy is nice. I don't think it's necessary. Like, you can still believe in the Bible, like, to kind of salvific purposes, and believe that there are errors in the Bible. But inerrancy is nice. And it's also, like, I think it's tantalizingly attainable. Like, considering how long and broad the Bible is, there are actually very few cases where you really have to be like, this looks like a mistake. Usually there are explanations. You could say, well, it's exaggeration, it's something else. And I don't think it's, and this is something I'm kind of going to touch on at a later point, I don't think it's unreasonable to do that. I don't think it's like moving the goalpost or anything like that. Exaggeration is the thing that happens. Like, it's genuinely so unreasonable to say that, like, inferring that there are literary devices in the Bible is an unreasonable, like, moving of the goalpost or begging the question or something like that. Not begging the question, I don't think. Special pleading, that's what I'd say. No, literary devices exist, and it would be, if anything, completely ridiculous to assume that they don't exist in the Bible, that there's, like, no exaggeration in the Bible. The problem becomes when you get very specific numbers. And I believe we're told that the number of men in the Israelite camp that leaves Egypt is 613,000. I frankly don't really care if I got that exactly accurate, but it's it's over 600,000 men. And people do some maths and say, well, okay, I think actually if you look to like standard kind of demographics for the time, this would place the overall Israelite population at like 2 million or something like that. Like, this is a huge army. or rather a huge group of people. And it creates like the numbers are just insane, because this was at a period like having just 2 million people moving around. I mean, people like to put the focus when they talk about like there not being any archaeological evidence for the Exodus, and it's like, oh, it's a big number. But to be honest, like every aspect of it in terms of that number is insane. It's like Egypt did not have, I think I saw somebody say like Egypt's population was maybe like 4 million at the time, which means if 2 million people left, then they lost either half their population, if it was like, if you're going to say that it was 4 million and then 2 million left, or a third of their population, if you're going to say there was 6 million and 2 million left, and then it went down to 4 million. Either way, the point is, this 2 million figure, and again, I think it's slightly less than 2 million, but it's still ridiculous. And of course, then you got like the army thing. Like I just went on this whole thing about how the Israelites did not establish themselves in Canaan, and that they went through like a cycle of being like oppressed and attacked and blah, 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 blah. So the question becomes, considering the fact that there's literally examples in the Torah of the Israelites coming up against battles against like just city states, like the Israelites encounter various city states and they have battles with them. It's like you have to wonder, how big were these city states that they were going up against a group of people with 600,000 fighting men? Like you think like who that's, and obviously you could say, well, maybe not all of them were really able to fight, but like there's no way. It's just bizarre. Like the numbers are just mind-bending relative to the time. Obviously you could say, well, these numbers aren't huge nowadays. I mean, it would be considered a relatively small country if it only had 2 million people. But yes, obviously for the 15th century BC, turns out, yeah, like this number is insane. And it's an issue, frankly. Like it's an issue. Like there's just no way. And on the one hand, so I'm kind of going to do point counterpoint. A almost like defense is to say, well, this number is so insane that there has to be another explanation. Like it's almost like it's so insane it can't actually be a mistake, because it's like it's such an insane mistake to make. Like it's impossible to believe that any, like even at the time when we're saying that this would have been written, which is kind of when would it have been written, that's a bit variable, but it's almost like hard to think, like even I don't think you even need to know much about ancient history to just recognize that number is insanely huge. And I think it's likely that the closer they were to that period in time, they would have thought this number seems insanely huge. Like it's hard to imagine that a scribe writing at any point kind of around the time when we might say the Torah could have been written would have not considered this number to be astronomically huge, and like it would not have struck them as a really huge number and would have given them like a moment of pause of like, no, this is not the right number. So it's almost, and within that context you think, how could it even be a mistake? Like the only reason why they might have included it is because they didn't actually view it as the real number. Now that becomes a bit of that creates a weird situation, which is, what do you mean not the real number? Now, there is one explanation which is very tempting, but then I think it has an issue. And I've not seen an explanation for this issue. Now, having said that, there's other instances where I've not seen explanations and I found explanations, so we'll see. Essentially, people say, when it says 600,000, 1,000 can just mean a group. So essentially, in the language, actually, like 1,000 can mean 1,000, but it can just mean, and it kind of makes sense. For example, if you say like, there were thousands of people there, or like you can sometimes use thousands to just mean like, just to represent a group. And you might be implying it's a large group, but you do not have to be implying it's like actually literally 1,000. But I think actually it goes even further, where 1,000 in this context can potentially mean not even necessarily a huge group. So it could be that this group could be not very big at all, in which case you've got 600 of a not very big group, and you could be looking at actually a not massive population. And at that point you can almost say it's almost like a free for all when it comes to how big you want to say this group is. Like you could say it's 600 groups of 3, and suddenly it's only 1,800 people. You know, it's at that point the number almost becomes literally anything you want it to be. Now that sounds, as long as it's more than, I guess, 1,200, you say, oh, it's 600 groups of 2. Again, I might be stretching exactly what 1,000 can be taken to mean, but I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying that it can just mean like a group, and it doesn't necessarily have to imply like a huge group. It doesn't even have to apply being close to 1,000. So it could be like, maybe you say it's 100, in which case 600 is 60,000. So you say, okay, it's 60,000 people. Well, that's considerably more believable. And it's also worth noting that this, like the use of the word men, it talks about, men a lot, and you could say, well, maybe that's not, because a part of it is obviously the extrapolation of, well, if it's 600,000 men, it has to be far more in terms of the actual population. Now, here's the issue. Later on in the Book of Numbers, it then goes on to actually number each individual tribe, and it gives very high numbers and also very specific numbers. So I think like it will be like, of this tribe there were 59,176. It gives these very, very specific numbers. So suddenly, as exciting as that whole prospect of this 600,000 can just mean anything, now it's like, oh wait, no, you have these very specific numbers later on that seem to line up with it being actually 600,000. So ultimately you do have an issue, which is that these numbers are quite difficult to interpret anything other than literally because of how specific they get later on. And it's possible that like actually there's some kind of symbolic thing going on where it's like, actually, we don't realize what the numbers mean. An alternative explanation, which would, I think, mean that you'd have to go beyond inerrancy, which is, like I say, I don't think you need inerrancy to believe in the Bible, but like I say, inerrancy, it's tantalizingly, like, possible as an option to be like, oh, it seems like you could make an argument that literally everything in the Bible is inerrant. So I think this would be abandoning that, which some people might not be comfortable with. To be honest, obviously I'm ignoring literalism, because if you're a literalist, then the Egyptian history intercepts with the Great Flood of the entire world. So yeah, if you're trying to match real history onto literalism, that just doesn't work at all. But in terms of, inerrantness, you don't have to argue that everything's literal. Like I've already said, literary devices exist. So yeah, within that context, but the issue is that if you are probably somebody who's not a literalist, you probably care about it matching up at least a little bit with history. So this huge number seems unappealing. And here's one explanation that occurred to me, which, like I say, would be abandoning inerrancy. So take it or leave it. I believe that the Bible was written by, edited by, changed by different authors at a later point. And something I was considering is the possibility that actually, at some point, a random scribe decides to do a census of Israel's current population at a later point, and that he decides to include this census in the book of Exodus, and this eventually leads to a situation where you get this number. It's just a theory I had as to how this number maybe got in there. And it would kind of, I guess the thing is, it would explain how it is that because I do think at some point Israel's population would have reached these kind of numbers. So I think, yeah, it would make sense. Maybe this was a later census which a scribe did, and then who knows, maybe he literally just stacked it with a copy of the Torah that he was kind of, inscribing. Is that a term? Copying so that there'd be more copies. And then eventually somebody gets a hold of his and they're putting it together and okay, I'm going to do it. And then they end up putting in his numbers and stuff. I could, that would be an interesting thing that I think maybe happened. I wouldn't mind. I'm perfectly fine for the Bible to have tell an interesting story in terms of its composition, or have an interesting story in terms of its composition. But obviously might be, you know, like, it's kind of also equally satisfying when you do come across explanations that can be like, oh wait, here's a way to understand it that would actually allow for it to not be a mistake. It's not an error. Whereas, of course, yes, if we're talking about, you know, I don't think you can say that somebody, and this is why, like, you know, like the whole thing about like literary devices just being like an excuse or like just a vaguely defined thing that doesn't have, well, no, this would clearly not be a literary device. If you know, like somebody making a mistake or, you know, including information that was not part of the original text and then that getting like included by other people and stuff like that. That's not a literary device. That is just a mistake. But you know, it's a scribal error. But yeah, there we go. I think it's a possibility. Ultimately, you know, the thing is, I'll say that like there's not like the main thing with the Exodus is that people say there's not really any evidence for it, which can be explained by the whole like fact that there was an attempt to literally erase history around the time when I think it's reasonable to think the Exodus might have happened. And also, yes, if the number is supposedly true, then you've got a lot of problems, one of which would be that you'd expect to see more evidence. But if we do allow for the fact that the number was considerably smaller, it becomes much less likely that you would expect to see archaeological evidence if you just got a much smaller group. Overall, you know, I mean, it's a lot of kind of, I guess, Christians or people who are enthusiastic about the Bible like to point to the classic example of the Hittites. The Hittites are mentioned in the Bible, and for a very long time, people assumed that this group didn't exist and that they were just made up by the Bible because there was no evidence. We had no evidence of the Hittites. This was back in the 19th century. And people were saying, oh, the Bible's nonsense, blah, blah, blah. And then turns out that we found out the Hittites did exist. They just existed. Not really much ambiguity to it. They were just a thing. And the Bible was vindicated. And I think people do like to point to that and they say, you doubt the Bible, but the Bible, like there were times when people thought, oh, this thing is mentioned in the Bible and it's not in the kind of backed up by other aspects of the historical record, therefore it must be wrong. And then the Bible was proved right. So I think people like to say, oh, so bear that in mind with the Exodus, which is kind of okay, but then at the same time it's like, well, back when people thought the Hittites weren't a thing, they had less reason to be confident of that because they, it was over 100 years ago. Now that history is much better understood, it seems increasingly less likely we're suddenly going to find like huge amounts of evidence of a significant thing. If there's anything that's really significant, then it seems like we should expect to find evidence of that, and yet we don't. Overall, I guess, how am I going to conclude this? I suppose one quick thing actually is like people might say, so ultimately this doesn't even prove the Bible is true. It's not like even if the Bible does actually match on to real life history, well, that doesn't make it divine. There's lots of things which are, attached to real life history. And that's true. I just think it's interesting, to be honest. Like, that's it. I just find it really fascinating that there is this like way which it lines up. And again, it's not, the thing is, you couldn't look at the Bible and get anything like close to a satisfactory history of Egypt. Like, the Bible would be worthless as a kind of source to actually build up any kind of like knowledge of Egypt. However, what's interesting is that it does just have these few little things, and these few little things do just match onto what is found in the actual history. And I find that interesting, kind of just like the way that it's just these, it's not trying to be this proper history, and yet it functions as an interesting kind of parallel to what we actually know was happening historically. So that's the end of the video. Again, enjoy your Advent.